Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Understanding the Israeli War of Independence from the Jewish perspective. Al-Nakba, the catastrophe from the Muslim-Palestinian perspective. Probably best described as the first battle or the first installment of the Israeli-Arab War or Israel-Palestinian War. Every conflict fought since then is basically on the same exact issue. It's just been continuing over time. So if one understands what the background and what happened there, you understand what's happening today, including the riots at the Gaza border. So there's a vast amount of history to cover, and what I want to do is present some of the themes that I think are important for understanding, first of all, how Israel won the war, or maybe even better put, how the Arab side lost the war. Secondly, the refugee question, how that got created. And there are, again, lots of historical opinions, but there is a factual basis we can talk about. And secondly, why the war was fought. I mean, could the war have been avoided? So those are some of my questions. Does anybody have something that you really want me to address tonight that you came here that you wanted answered, so I can see if I can integrate that into my talk? Of course, I'm talking to the people in the live audience, not the Facebook audience. Yes? That's a great question. So the question is, what was the British policy during this time? And of course, it was a very difficult path for the British, and I think their policy changed over time. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start with the first, oh yes, and right here. Who represented the Arab/Palestinians during the period up until the partition? Okay, as far as the name. If you look in the Bible, the coastline of the land of Israel had an area that was inhabited by the Plishtim. Plishtim is very, very likely to be the word that produced the word Palestine. Who are the Plishtim? The Hebrew word Plishtim etymologically is from the Hebrew word polesh, which means to invade. So there's a theory that the Plishtim were people who had left probably an area of Greek culture. Not sure if it's the Greek islands or somewhere around the Mediterranean basin of Asia Minor. Came to the coast of the land of Israel and set up their cities there. So there's very clearly a conflict, for example, you see in the Bible, between King Saul and the Plishtim. What happens to the Plishtim, we don't know. That once David becomes king and time goes on, they seem to just rather disappear as a people. Very likely what happened to the Plishtim is what happened to all of the indigenous inhabitants, was that they assimilated into the tribes of Israel, to the population of the people of Israel. Let me give you a little example. The book of Joshua says that the Israelites who are coming back to their homeland are to eradicate the 7 Canaanite nations, including the Hittites. Well, you come to the book of Samuel, and a Hittite captain lives across the street from King David. And the Hittite captain is actually married to an Israelite woman named Bathsheba. So how is it that the book of Joshua says, get rid of all the 7 Canaanite nations, including the Hittites, and you have Uriah the Hittite living across the street from David? So very likely what happens is the book of Joshua is very clearly written. This is from a non-Orthodox, non-fundamentalist perspective. The book of Joshua is clearly written at the end of the First Temple period. Around when the book of Deuteronomy is probably written, you might say the temple is destroyed about 586 BCE. In the 50 or 100 years right before that was when you had what's called the Deuteronomic Reformation. The book of Deuteronomy was written, and the book of Joshua. How do we know that? Well, there are many, many different strata of the Hebrew language. And when you're reading through the Torah and you suddenly hit the book of Deuteronomy, it's really a different Hebrew. And the same Hebrew as the book of Joshua, same Hebrew as the book of Jeremiah, for example. So that's how scholars are able to locate it. So what happened? In the end of the First Temple period, the local nations had all assimilated. So there were not any more 7 Canaanite nations. So they figured that Joshua must have killed them all, when obviously Joshua didn't kill them all because they were still around during the time of King David and King Saul. Probably the same thing with the Plishtim. As far as you know, once you really had the hegemony of the Israelite kingdom, remember they divided into 2, they had northern Israel, southern Judea. they probably assimilated. But the term continued, and when the Romans destroyed Judea, both in the Great Revolt in the year 70 and the Bar Kokhba Revolution in was 132 to 135 CE, the Romans decided to eradicate Jewish life. So Jerusalem was not only destroyed, but renamed to Aelia Capitolina. When you see many names of ancient biblical sites also have Roman names. So Shechem was called Naples, Arabic Nablus, for example. So all over the place, original Judean names were given Latin names, and the Jewish population was destroyed or enslaved throughout Judea. The Romans then didn't even want the name Judea, so the Romans gave it the term Palestine. Now, clearly there were no Palestinians living there. There were just ex-Judeans, a few that survived, and maybe some of the local population came in. But the Romans called it the province of Palestine. So when the Arab conquest occurred in the 600s-700s, they just kept the term. It was a geographical district, like the Rocky Mountains. You know, the Rocky Mountains is a geographical district. It doesn't name the people, it just names where the people live. Ottomans, the same thing. I don't think the Ottomans thought of the people there as Palestinians. I think they thought them as mostly Arabs by this point. But they used like the district of Jerusalem, district of Palestine, and so forth. So when you begin to have the idea of Palestinian national consciousness, the name Palestine became assigned to the people who lived in Palestine. Interestingly, the first Jewish community called themselves Palestinian Jews, meaning Jews who lived in the area called Palestine. So it wasn't as if Palestine was named after the Palestinian people, but rather the Palestinian people were named after Palestine. Okay? So when we move into the period of the what's called the Aliyah, meaning the intentional movement of Jews into the Ottoman district we'll call Palestine, there was a conscious sense that Jewish life in Europe was unsustainable. You see this very clearly at the First Zionist Congress in 1894, the sentiment, if we don't get out of here, they're going to kill every single one of us. In fact, some people actually articulated that exact sentiment. Most Jews moved to England and North America, those who emigrated. Many came to Turkey, the Turkish province called Palestine. The Jewish agency bought up land. So there's a lot of work in the Jewish world to actually raise money to buy land. They bought land from Arab landowners, were given grants by the Turkish government. So a Jewish population began. And there was some resentment, although we don't see it very active up until the First World War. The First World War, all immigration in that area ceases. In 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration. Balfour was the equivalent of the British Secretary of State. And he said, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that was understood to be a commitment of the British government. So after the war ended, by 1919, you found Jewish immigration. And already in 1920, there was an anti-Jewish riot, for example, in Jerusalem. So the sentiment began to turn harsh from the Arab side. So you might say Palestinian consciousness developed along with Zionism. See, prior to Zionism, you don't see any drive for a Palestinian self-government or anything. But what you do find is during the First World War, an Arab revolt against the Turks, and they wanted the Europeans to help them. Anybody remember who the most notable European was who helped the Arab revolt? Lawrence of Arabia, exactly. So that's that story. So the Arabs wanted to get out of the the heel of the Ottoman Turks, and you might say there was a sense that they would achieve their own nation. Of course, it wasn't granted them. After the First World War, basically Britain and France divided up the Middle East, and the Arab countries found themselves under the British and the French, as Palestine was under the British. Okay, so that brings us up to about 1920. There is immigration. and I'll call it the local Arab population is feeling threatened, and animosity begins to develop. As the animosity develops, one thing that the Jewish population does, we'll call it the Yishuv now, Y-I-S-H-U-V, they realize that there is so much hostility from the Palestinian side, the Arab side, that they in a way create their own government. They create their own electric grid, water supply. They realize they have to be somewhat independent. Now, they're European, so they get along better with the British because they probably share a common language. On the Arab side, they never really created a conscious government of Arabs like the Yishuv on the other side. And one reason for that is there were competitions for power in Palestine. So, for example, when the British made al-Husseini the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, not everybody wanted al-Husseini to be the Grand Mufti. So what you see on the Arab side, jockeying for power and not wanting to grant one person more power than the others. So the Arab side in Palestine suffered from their own divisiveness. So there was hostility between the Jews and the Arabs. The British government during this time probably a little more encouraging of the Jews, meaning similar European outlook. And the Arabs had a tough time organizing themselves because of inner disunity. Now, a couple of things happened that really set everything in motion. And one of them is the Hebron massacre in 1929. Now, Hebron had an ancient Jewish community. They spoke Arabic. They dressed like Arabs. They were Sephardic Jews, but completely integrated into the city and culture in Hebron. At the same time, there was movement from Jews from Eastern Europe into Hebron, and they moved into the north end of the city. In fact, some of the local Arabs actually built housing and moved them in there. In 1929, the word went out that the Jews are going to try to take over the Temple Mount and destroy the Temple Mount. Now, these rumors were wild and vicious. When you think about it, it's beyond comprehension that the Jews in Palestine would want to get together and destroy the Temple Mount, but the word got out. So the riots in Hebron, about 70 Jews were murdered and really butchered. I mean, these were men, women, children, and it was the local population just went after them with guns and knives, and they were completely defenseless. The British found out too late to step in. About 450 Jews survived the massacre, and Jewish life in Hebron was utterly extinguished. Now, up until that time, the local Jewish community, they did have guards. They had the Bar Giora, they had Hashomer. They did have groups, but more or less for security against brigands and thieves, not really against the Arabs. At that time, the Jewish community became very self-conscious. They're out to kill us. Not all, but enough. So there were two reactions. One was the creating of the Haganah, which means defense in Hebrew. So a self-defense militia that would guard the oftentimes very scattered settlements. And they had a full-time, you might say, commando group called the Palmach, Plugot Machatz. So the Haganah was more or less a militia that would be called out when needed. The different kibbutzim and villages, they all had their own Haganah group. Haganah was active in Tel Aviv and Haifa. So the Jewish community began to create a self-conscious militia, but very, very territory-based, which means the militia in the Galilee, didn't have an agreement to come to the aid of the militia in Jerusalem or somewhere else. But the Haganah was a loose national organization. Remember, they're under the view of the British, so the training had to be relatively in secret. Arms acquisition had to be done in secret. But you might say it was a known secret. At the same time, the Haganah comes into being, let's say about 1930. By the way, the policy of the Haganah was called Havlaga, which means self-restraint. We're not going to do reprisals, we're going to defend. Right? And if the Palmach does do an action, it's against specific targets with a very limited scope. Two other groups came into being. and they are, I think, accurately described as Jewish terrorist group. By terrorism, I mean hitting targets that are not military targets, where it's not specific people you're trying to kill, but just the enemy, both as revenge and to strike terror in the heart of the other population. So, for example, during the time, the Arab side blew up a movie theater and they hit the Jewish agencies. And those are terrorists because it's not a military target. You're murdering civilians, but it's part of a larger aim to demoralize the enemy. Well, Irgun and Lehi, Irgun meaning the group, Lehi, also called the Stern Gang, two different groups, but agreed in the idea that if the Arabs are going to massacre us and commit terrorism against us, we're going to do it right back to them. So they were very disruptive during the 1930s. And again, the tension was building. Jewish population was expanding. A lot of Arab resentment against it. The Haganah was more or less defending. And Irgun and Lehi now and then would do, commit, you might call, revenge strikes. But everything at a very low level. Any questions so far here in the room about any of this? Yes. The histories of the two groups are so complex, but in general, the Irgun was the more moderate, and the Stern Gang were they were smaller and a little more vicious. Okay? Now remember, they were hunted down by the British, and there was a kind of a decision, oh, that's what you're going to do to us? We'll do it to you. But the Hebron massacre really changed things. It's, if you want to understand the war, you have to understand what the Hebron massacre did to the Jewish population. Because the sense was, if we are not militarily sufficient and don't separate ourselves from the Arabs, our lives are in danger. So that there you begin to have a real consciousness to separate out, close off, and to make the different Jewish settlements defensively sustainable. And be able to defend themselves so that Haganah from other kibbutzim and so forth could come and help. Now, this is going to be crucial a few years later, so remember this. Every kibbutz, every settlement, has typically an indigenous Haganah force, plans to call other Haganah, stockpiling weapons and food, typically small arms, pistols and rifles, with the idea of we can hold off an attack until help comes. That's the idea. Now, the next thing that happens, which has profound consequences, is the Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939. Why is it so significant? Well, the Arabs in Palestine saw that Iraq had gotten its independence, Egypt had gotten its independence, Syria and Jordan were on their way to independence, and the Palestinians said, well, we want independence from Britain. The British said, absolutely not. And so the Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939 was anti-British. Okay? Terrorism against the British Army, street battles against the British Army, and the British response was very, very heavy-handed. They simply wanted to stamp out this revolt. There were probably, some 6,000 Arabs died, mostly young men in combat, maybe 12,000 or so injured. And the notables in different Arab towns took off because the Grand Mufti said, the war against the British is a holy war, and if you don't agree with me, you're a heretic. So any Arab that did not fight on his side, that wanted actually to accept the British mandate, was also the enemy. So there was the Arab uprising against the British and fighting against each other. And it led to economic devastation among the Arabs in Palestine. Remember, the Jews were somewhat insulated because they really had their own. The Yishuv was economically, in many other ways, insulated from the Arab side, just as the Arabs were insulated from the Jewish side. So the devastation that hit the Arab population, number one, depopulation. About 10%, if I'm not mistaken, 10% of all the males were killed or wounded. So there are about 200,000 males between 20 and 60, with 6,000 dead and 12,000 wounded and so forth. That's 1 out of 10 was killed or wounded in this uprising. Economic devastation. Many of the wealthier families left because they didn't want to oppose the Grand Mufti. So the British were able to put down the Arab revolt, but with great loss of life, economic devastation on their side. The Grand Mufti, as far as I recall, fled. Some of them, by the way, fled to Germany and became part of the German military, came back later to fight on the Arab side. And of course, soon after that, we have the Second World War, and the British just don't want any trouble from anybody on this side. The Arabs are basically anti-British. The Jews are basically pro-British. So what you have on the Jewish side is the desire to join the British Army, and you have many people in the Haganah just join the British Army and Navy, British military forces, and also desire to create a Jewish brigade, which I believe gets trained and finally launched about 1944. They fight in Italy. Okay? The war ends. The members of the Haganah who are in the British military are demobilized. The Jewish brigade comes home. The Haganah, of course, is greatly strengthened by all these military veterans. And the Arab side sees what's happening. And the British begin just to be sick of the situation. The terrorism, the fighting, attacking each other, attacking the British. The Stern Gang and Lehi attacked the British, just like the Arabs did. We want the British out of here. So you can imagine the violence. The British basically said, turning this over to the United Nations, you decide what to do with it, we're out of here. Okay? Any questions up to here? Yes. Why did they gave political independence, but not really independence. Okay, like with the Iraqis, they said, you're a separate government, but your foreign policy will be conducted in close cooperation with the British Empire. So-called Transjordan was given independence, but not really fully till 1946. The British still ran the military. Same with the French. Syria was, as it were, independent, but not really fully independent until 1944. So the French and the British had a hard time actually acknowledging the empire's over. So this happened all over. Look at the British tried to hold on to Indochina to the very bitter end. So the idea of the British just pull out, I don't think it was in their consciousness, but by 1946 it was. The question is, pull out, and then what happens? I mean, they did have a mandatory government. I think they felt responsible to be a good government. You just want to pack up and leave, because that's just going to lead to complete riotous chaos. So the British try to follow a procedure. Turn over to the United Nations. The United States has hearings and so forth. They finally vote in November 1947 in favor of the partition, which is, let's see, this is the armistice line. Let me bring up the partition here. Let's see, I think I have this backwards. Yes. This is the partition that's agreed upon. So the Jewish state, you'll notice, on the coast, settlements up in the Galilee. Here's the coastal up here, and the Negev. Palestinians are in, you might say, the central Galilee, all throughout Judea and Samaria, Gaza Strip. This is likely the Hebron district, and along the border with Egypt. So roughly around where population centers were, the idea being that if Jews who entered in Arab lands would move to the Jewish sector, and Arabs who were in Jewish lands would move to the Arab sector. This was the theory. Nobody liked it at all. So the Jews thought this was completely indefensible. On the Arab side, they said it was completely unlawful, meaning you can't come here and divide this up. It's our land, which leads to a very, very interesting, not just political, but philosophic question. How does a people get title? Do you understand? How does a people get title? So the Ottomans owned the land. When the Ottomans were defeated in 1917-18, the British owned the land. You had Palestinians living on the land, but the land belonged, as it were, to the British. Now, they had a mandate over it, but because the name was called Palestine, didn't mean that Palestinians owned it. Okay? It's very important to remember that. So the area is called Palestine, but there are Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews. The Jews call themselves Palestinians. The Jerusalem Post was called the Palestinian Post. The Jewish brigade in the British Army was the Palestinian Brigade. Okay? So the word Palestinian meant if you live in Palestine, which is a geographical district. So the idea that it's called Palestine doesn't mean it belonged to Palestinians, it belonged to the Turks and then to the British. Now, from their point of view, the Jewish influx was part of European colonization that was happening all over Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The idea that Jews coming from Eastern Europe were not colonizers, but rather people returning to their ancient homeland was completely rejected on the Arab side. You're colonists like the Jews in Algeria and the French in Southeast Asia. You're simply European colonists. Remember, that is not the Jewish consciousness. The Jewish consciousness is, no, this is our homeland from which we were expelled, and now we're coming back. So from the Jewish perspective, in the very beginning, they said, yeah, coexistence. We're living under the Ottomans. You live in your villages. We live in our villages. We're going back to our homeland. We have the Yishuv. We'll try to create some kind of contiguous Jewish culture. But after the events of 1929 and further, suddenly there's uneasy feeling, we're not going to be coexist. We're going to have borders. But remember, there was commingling of population in different villages. You might have an Arab village here, a kibbutz here, an Arab village here. So the idea of separating was a very tough idea. But through 1946, 1947, I think it became clear to both sides that a war was coming, and it was going to be a war over territory. Both sides realized a war was coming, and it would be a war over territory. Now, the Jews agreed to this because they thought, well, it's the best deal we're going to get, we'll live here. From the Arab side, even the idea of partitioning was, for them, a great moral offense, and they said, absolutely not. So when the partition happened, the Jews accepted it, the Arab side didn't. Now, remember, I'm not trying to fault the Arab side, I'm stating a fact. They thought the UN has no right whatsoever. On the other side, they said they had as much right as the Ottoman Turks had in whatever they want to do, and the British, and now the UN. So Palestine wasn't owned by Palestinians. Palestinians lived in Palestine. And the British and the UN were just doing whatever any other conqueror did, which was basically use and divide up the land as they liked. So did the UN have the legitimacy to do this? The UN obviously thought that it did. The United Nations clearly thought that they had the legitimacy to create the partition so the British could leave. Okay? Any questions up till here? Yeah, in the back. The tilt toward the Arabs when they realized the oil on the Arab side, the danger that there would be a great aligning with Germany, which they did not want to have to fight another front, and the Jews were pro-British anyway. So the sense was, well, we already have the Jews, so we don't need to be pro-Jewish. We need to bring the Arabs in. Because what they didn't want was an Arab revolt against the British, as there had been an Arab revolt against the Turks. I was just trying to imagine if the Iraqis, if the Egyptians went pro-British during the Battle of Tobruk. So remember, this is during the Second World War. The British needed the Arab countries to be pro-British, or at least not anti-British. So it was in England's self-interest that they mollify the Arabs as much as they could. From the Arab side, they would say very little. From the Jewish side, we would say very much. I think if you look at it historically, you'll find a tilt toward the Arabs after 1939. Yishuv is from the Hebrew word to settle. Liyashev means to settle, a settlement. They're called the Yishuvim, so it's a word that means a settlement. Why did the British turn back ships that were coming in after the war? Because the British had decided to control Jewish immigration to mollify the Arabs. So there wasn't open borders. If you wanted to come to Palestine, you had to apply for a visa and go through regular channels and legally come in. From the Jewish side, that was their homeland, and they were going to try to bust the blockade and get many of these people as they wanted. Look, I mean, the British were trying to mollify the Arabs. The Arabs didn't want any more Jewish immigrants at all. And the Yishuv had a strong interest in getting as many immigrants as they can because they knew a war was coming. And immigrants meant, more people. Number one, I think they wanted to save European Jewry, clearly. But they also knew it added to their economic power and their military power. So everybody knew what was up. Everybody's cards were on the table. The British keep the Jews out, Arabs keep the Jews out, Yishuv get the Jews in, for a variety of moral and economic reasons. Yes. Yeah, if you include everything, not just here, you probably had about 1.2 million Palestinians and about 600,000 Jews. So the partition that you have here actually wasn't completely, off the rocker. Meaning the area that was, that they have here was half and half or majority Jewish, and the other Arabs were majority Palestinian. I'm going to use the word Palestinian now to mean Palestinian Arab. Yep. Wasn't arbitrary. I mean, the UN had commissions go down and studied the situation. I mean, they really mapped out where do these different people live and where do we draw the line. So they really studied it quite carefully. They came up with this. Again, the Jews said indefensible, and the Arabs said absolutely not. There's no oil in Palestine. Yeah. There's no, not that we know of. Yeah. Okay, question over here. Okay, I'll repeat this out for everybody. Okay, very good. So let's say David Ben-Gurion, great strategist, European-oriented, Jews who came back from the war, they had military training, some actually in higher command and so forth. You cannot forget the devastation to the Palestinian population in the revolt of 1936 to 39. Masses of elites left the country. The sides were bitterly divided against each other. Great hatreds remained. Remember, the Mufti said, if you're not with me, you're a heretic. There's a jihad on. Okay, thank you. So the Jews were ahead because they were European, okay? I mean, Europe was ahead of the Arab world. But the Arabs fell behind further because of the Arab revolt. For example, had all of the Arabs gotten behind the Grand Mufti, and had they had and no divisions of jealousy of who's going to be in charge of what, which, by the way, plagued the Arab side till the end of the war, and even till today. So let's say they had a unified command. They actually called it an Arab High Command, which, again, didn't command much. It's possible that they could have figured out a defensive strategy. But remember, their infrastructure, their capacity to organize was destroyed between 36 and 39. And after the war, when the fact of war became obvious, you had, for example, in some Arab countries, the fear that the Husseini family in Jordan would take over the holy sites. Well, the Saudi Arabians didn't want that because they had Mecca, Medina, and they wanted Jerusalem. Meaning, if Jordan was going to claim Jerusalem, everybody else wanted to claim Jerusalem away from them. So not only did they want to conquer the land, they also wanted to make sure that others didn't get more than they had, which was another reason and remember, each of these different sides had their own interest in Palestine. So you had, you might say, Iraqi factions or Jordanian factions, Egyptian factions, and so forth, and religious factions. On the Jewish side, there was more unity when it comes to national policy. Yeah. Yes. Question over here. Yeah. We're gonna now get to the war. Okay. So by 1946, everybody knows there's a war coming. The Haganah is busy trying to get troops, Haganah trained to get arms in. By the way, the Palestinian side is doing very much the same thing. The Arab armies, let's say Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, they're letting the Yishuv know, if you declare independence, we will invade and destroy you. If you don't declare independence, we may find a way to coexist. Well, I'll say a general consensus among the Palestinian Arabs, we'll call that they became the ALA, the Arab Liberation Army. That's what they became. So I'll just call them the ALA. So it became the ALA. And the other countries said to the Jews, if you declare independence, we will destroy you and we'll push you into the sea. There will not be a Jew left. If you don't declare independence, we're not going to push you into the sea, but you will live under Arab rule. That's your choice. Live under Arab rule or die. That was the choice given to the Yishuv, to the Palestinian Jews. And there was great trepidation, great discussion, because the Yishuv was not confident that they could win a war. They were not confident. The Arab side was 100% confident they could win the war, which actually affected how the war was fought. The Jewish side with a sense of a kind of an existential desperation. We could very well lose this thing. And the Arab side with complete conviction that they're going to win it, and rather easily. Those points of view actually had a lot to do with the conduct of the war, which I'll get to in just a second. Yeah, question back here. I'd say all during this period. Remember, the UN was studying it for quite a while. And plans were going back and forth. And the message was given, don't you dare accept the partition, because we will invade and we will destroy you. So I would say 46 all throughout. So the planners knew about this, but now here's the dilemma. The British are leaving. The British are going to leave. The Jews want the partition. If the British are going to leave, who's going to step in and keep these two fighters apart? Which country is going to step in, remember, with great treasure and troops and loss of life, to go in and fight off the Jews and the Arabs and put order here? Who's going to commit that many troops, 1948, after the exhaustion of World War II? Thank you. So at the UN, they knew what was coming, but remember, the British were leaving. The British said, we're leaving. So you can do one of two things. Let these two people figure it out, or some other great nation comes in and puts in 50,000 of their soldiers. It's one or the other, you understand? It's either let them fight it out or somebody else take over. So at that time, nobody raised their hand. The UN, basically, when the Jews said, we have a reasonable chance of defending our state. We want our state. Arabs said, we'll crush you. And the Jews said, not so quick. I mean, remember, again, I want to focus on this. From the Jewish side, there was a sense of existential despair among many they didn't talk about. But they weren't going to go home. They were not going to live under, again, an oppressive boot of people who hated them and massacred them at Hebron and other places. They were not going to live at the mercy of these Arab governments. Again, this is the tragedy of Hebron, of you're going to come in and you're going to rule us, and you're going to disband our Haganah, disband our Al-Parmach, confiscate all our weapons, and we're just going to trust you? You people who massacred the Jews of Hebron, massacred the Jews of Safed, blew up buses. No, we don't trust you. So the question is, what do you do when you're cornered? Well, surrender might be surrender to a massacre. And so it's a kind of a steely determination that's hard for us to imagine. You got to put yourself there. You got to say to yourself, well, I'd rather die fighting than surrender and die in a massacre. I would say many Jews thought about it just like that. So either die in a massacre or die fighting. What's our choice? It's a pretty dreadful choice, but I really think that that was in the air on the Jewish side. When the Haganah leaders were asked, they said, we have a 50-50 chance of survival. They gave themselves a 50-50 chance. Okay. So once the partition is proclaimed at the end of November 1947, you might say the first phase of the war began, which was a phase of more or less on the Arab side, attacking the roads, because the Jews had many far-flung settlements that had to be resupplied, including Jerusalem. So during this time, there were some massacres, mass killings that took place when Jews were cornered. For example, in the Haifa oil refinery, there was an anti-Jewish, I think 47 Jews were murdered in an anti-Jewish riot in Haifa. So you found this happening, and then of course the Lehi Irgun side would strike back. You had the terrorist attack on the Jewish Agency, a terrorist attack on an Arab movie theater, a terrorist attack on a Jewish movie theater, anti-Jewish riots in the Tel Aviv area. So things were really heating up. The most dramatic thing during this time, though, was the closing of the road to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem had to be sustained by water, electricity, power from the Tel Aviv area. So to look at the map here. So here's Jerusalem. Here's Tel Aviv. and this is the road that had to be taken. And if you look at these two sides here, the two sides of the road were areas of Arab villages. So the Arab villagers could actually shoot down on the convoys, and some of these convoys were virtually wiped out. Now remember, there were no prisoner of war camps. You couldn't surrender. So if a Jewish convoy was attacked, every person was killed. And unfortunately, again, I say unfortunately because it helped determine the war, not just attacked and killed, but also butchered. Now this is something that I don't quite understand, that once you killed somebody, you cut off the ears and cut off the genitals and things like that. But I also heard about this going on in Vietnam and other places, something that Western armies typically don't engage in, but the Arab irregulars did. There's no evidence that Arab regular soldiers did this, but the irregulars, meaning Palestinian villagers, did this. No, there were no regular Arab soldiers until May 15th. So all you had was villagers. Villagers that were being run by people who were sent in. So they went to the hilltops, shot down at the convoys, disabled them, came down, murdered everybody in the convoy, and mutilated them. So this is historically accurate, and it was terrifying because Jerusalem was being cut off. So between November and March, I would say not one Jewish settlement was taken over, but Jerusalem became isolated. And by the end of March, the Arab irregulars had won the war for Jerusalem, which means the road to Jerusalem was sealed. That's the second phase of the war, is in end of March, April, until May 15th, when the Haganah for the first time went on the offensive. Remember, the Haganah had a very clear policy: we defend, we defend, we defend, we don't attack. But the Arab villages on the ridges above the road were, number one, starving Jerusalem, and number two, massacring the convoys. So the Haganah went on the offensive to clear the ridges. So a series of battles were fought on these ridges to clear out these Arab villages, and if not clear them out, at least to clear out the fighters. Now, it's during this time that the well-known massacre at Deir Yassin happened. The Irgun and Lehi were part of the offensive force. They went into a village called Deir Yassin. Things got out of hand from their perspective, and they went on a shooting spree, and they killed 100 of the maybe 400 villagers. And if you look at Irgun and Lehi from their perspective, we're getting back for Hebron. Like we finally have, in my mind, none of them will admit it. I'll just give you Finley's interpretation. They finally said to themselves, "We're going to do to you what you did to us. You massacred our innocent people, we're going to massacre you people. We don't have any pity on you, didn't pity us." Now, the Haganah would never have done such a thing. But again, with the Deir Yassin massacre, the Arab world publicized it in order to create a fury of hatred to attack the Jews. Unfortunately, for the Arab side, it had the opposite effect. It created a panic. Because they were used to the Haganah's haflaga. And, when the Jews sent a unit, it's the famous 35 very well-known, high-caliber guys were sent down from Jerusalem to the Etzion block to southeast, and they were killed to the last man and mutilated and photographed. And the photographs were passed around. And these photographs got to the Jewish side. On the Jewish side, there was a revulsion and a hardening of position. From the Arab side, after Deir Yassin, they were terrified that the Jews were going to get revenge for Hebron. They knew it had happened. They knew they had massacred the 35. They knew they had massacred these convoys, and now the Jews had the upper hand. Now, I want to tell you how deep this was etched into Arab memory. In the 6 Days War, when the Israeli army rolled into Hebron, they were terrified of a massacre, that the Israelis were going to get the Arab population back. Now, the soldiers who rolled into Hebron, it was the last thing on their minds. So they rolled in, and they said, "Please don't." They said, "Why would he kill you?" They said, and they were pleading for their lives. They said, "We're not going to hurt you people. Just relax." And they said, you're not going to massacre us because of Hebron? They said, like, that was like 1929, 1967, yeah. They just said, go back to your homes. Everything's going to be fine. But look at their consciousness. So the consciousness was, you're going to get revenge for 1929. And we're terrified, and please don't kill us. You go back to 1948, with the Jews finally going on the attack, you found terror among the Arabs, it had a boomerang effect on the Arab population. So what began to happen, just as happened during the Arab Revolt, the wealthy, the notables, the people who had means left the area, which detrimentally affected the capacity for leadership. Okay, so there was a great fear, and an exodus already began. Not an expulsion, but an exodus because of fear. Fear that Deir Yassin was not an anomaly, which it was never repeated, but the fear that this was now the policy of the Haganah. Probably by this point, the Palmach was about 2,000, a brigade. The Haganah was mobilized for this, maybe another 2 brigades. So you may have maybe 6,000 to 7,000 full-time soldiers by this point. But still, Haganah was a volunteer militia force. Israel had no ability to draft anybody or anything. It wasn't a country. But anyway, just so I can move along, the second phase of the war was April 1948, where Israel is able, the Yishuv was able to open back up the road. The date is getting closer for Israel independence. The British are pulling out. The Arabs are saying, do not do this. We will come in and crush you. And at the end, the Yishuv National Board voted, I think it was something like 16-9 or something like that, in favor of independence. They declare their independence on our calendar, 14 May 1948 in the evening. And already at that time, the minute the announcement went on the radio, the invasion happened from the Egyptian side. So the invasion happened virtually the next day. Okay? So any brief questions here? I'll take you through what happens next. Yes? Yeah, well, thank you. So remember, during this time in getting ready, Golda Meir, for example, came to the United States, raised a huge amount of money for 1948. And there were arms embargoes. The British were still there. So they basically went around and bought scrap military gear. Imported from Czechoslovakia was a big arms manufacturer. They bought arms from Czechoslovakia. They actually smuggled in 1 shipload, which actually gave the Haganah, even before they had 1 rifle for every 3 guys. So with the smuggling in 1 boatload from Czechoslovakia, they were able to arm more people. Remember, we're talking about pistols, rifles, maybe a few light machine guns. The Israelis had manufactured their own submachine gun. Israelis had created their own mortar. Didn't work very well, but it was frightening. And they had a hodgepodge of basically European weapons, but enough to feel confident. So the raising of money was, for our purposes, to buy arms, smuggle in what they could, but have everything waiting for May 15th. So you might say there's this big arms shipment to Israel just waiting to go. They had Piper Cubs. There was an Israeli Air Force. I think it was less than 10 Piper Cubs. Now, these Piper Cubs did play a role, because a Piper Cub, you can shoot from the Piper Cub, and you can bring in mail, and you can actually bring in, maybe a few pounds of material. They had welding shops, so they could weld, they could weld an iron side to a car, call it an armored car. Yeah, they did. The Haganah had absolutely no military equipment when they declared a state. They had a loosely confederated militia, a minimum of arms, almost all small arms, but a shipment waiting to come. Now remember, you got to get trained on this stuff, and you got to learn how to work this stuff. But it was in the pipeline, ready to go. The Haganah had virtually none. It was on its way, though. So they were like maybe anti-tank weapons, small armor. But all this had to come in, unloaded, put together, trained, and then get out to the field as soon as they could. Now, by the way, during this time, there was a yishuv, a settlement southeast of Jerusalem called the Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, one place called Kfar Etzion, about 3 little ones nearby. And the Arab Legion, which was the best of the Arab armies, made a concerted attempt to conquer Gush Etzion. They were able to break through after very, very bitter fighting. So as far as I recall, a few hundred Jews, Haganah people died, which was a lot of people. A few hundred had died in the War of the Roses. So the Haganah was taking serious losses. When the people in Etzion surrendered, eyewitnesses say that the Arab Legion was holding them at bay, but the villagers came in with their weapons and they massacred every person who surrendered. Remember, this gets out. So now the realization is we can't surrender because the Arab Legion more or less let the villagers come in and massacre everybody there. So from what they know, about maybe 125 people were massacred. A few under 100 other people died, fought to the bitter end. And remember, once the Arabs got into it, they completely burned the place down. There's another thing we saw happening was every Jewish settlement captured, the residents were expelled or killed, and the settlement was burned to the ground. That set up a tone. This was a battle for land, and every Arab village now remember, not every village were people expelled, but some of them where there was bitter fighting, they burnt it to the ground on the Jewish side as well, because we realized we don't want an Arab population coming back here. This is going to be part of our contiguous border. It didn't happen very often on the Jewish side, but it happened enough that it was clearly, if not an unstated policy, the battle for the land. So by May 15th, entrenched on both sides was the idea we're fighting to the bitter end and we're fighting for land. Now, as far as what happens when the war actually begins, you'll see here. So you have, let's see, is it down? Yes. This is the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army had 2 plans. One was come up to the coast and hit Tel Aviv. The other was to come through here, get to Hebron, which is here, and up to Jerusalem, to make sure that the Jordanians couldn't claim Jerusalem of their own. The Jordanians were coming here. The Iraqis were across here, and they wanted to capture Haifa, because they wanted a pipeline from the Iraqi oil fields across Jordan up to here. The Syrians were coming here, and the Lebanese were coming here. So the now Israelis more or less knew what the plan was. They had to fight a southern front, a central front against the Jordanians, a northern front against the Syrians at the border and against the Lebanese, and throughout the land against the Arab Liberation Army, which was, but they're becoming more regular now. So for example, the officers in the ALA were oftentimes trained army officers. They had relatively good weapons. They had armor, they had armored cars, they had tanks. So they didn't have the advantage of a long-standing professional army, but they had professional officers and relatively high-quality military equipment. And they fought mostly in the Galilee. So the division of labor was Syrians come in north and south of the Sea of Galilee, Jordanians come across, Egyptians from the south, Lebanese from the north, and in the end, the ALA in the Galilee area. Okay? That was their invasion plan. Okay, yes. The ALA got its equipment from the Arab countries. They were shipping weapons in. The irony was the Jews couldn't get the weapons in through the coast. The British had a blockade, the Royal Navy. There was no blockade of the other side, so weapons were flowing into the ALA. The British had a policy, no Jewish immigration. They were sticklers, can I tell you? And I think by this time a little bit anti-Jewish because of the attacks by Irgun and Lehi. Look, some British were pro-Jewish, some were pro-Palestinian, but in general, on the eastern border, there was a flow of weapons. On the coast, there was interdiction up until May 15th. Question in the back. The funding for purchasing weapons was mostly from America, the United States. And one of the biggest suppliers was Czechoslovakia. But places all over the world, but as far as manufacturers from Czechoslovakia. who made relatively high-quality military equipment. Yes? Okay, now I'll say very briefly, a good number of volunteers came, Jewish and non-Jewish. They are called mitnadvei chutz la'aretz, foreign volunteers, machal. Some of them high-ranking officers who came and helped Israel in many, including field commanders. The most famous American was Mickey Marcus, who was probably going to be given the head of the Central Command until he was accidentally killed by an Israeli sentry, I think still in April, so he never really got command. But Machal made a big impression, especially at higher levels, at technical levels, mechanics, etc., and pilots. In fact, later on in May, when the Egyptians were coming up the coast, the first fighter, not Piper Cubs, but fighter planes took off, all German Messerschmitts, by the way, I think maybe one Spitfire, and they came in and hit the Egyptians. They didn't do a very good job militarily, but it was so surprising to the Egyptians that they suffered a reversal. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Back there. Okay, why did they get involved? I mean, there was a pan-Arabism, certainly, and unwillingness, from their perspective, European colonialism to get a toehold. Remember, they were kicking Europeans out. And from their perspective, Jews were just Europeans. They weren't people coming back home. For them, they were colonists. Right? Now, from the Jewish perspective, we're coming back home. We have nowhere else to go. So I don't think there's any question, any deep thinking why they're doing it. It's just obvious that they were going to do it. So the Haganah had a strategy for each one of these fronts. Now, the main strategy for the southern and northern fronts, putting aside the battle for Jerusalem, for the settlements was don't give 1 inch. And so, for example, as the Egyptian army began rolling up toward Tel Aviv, they wanted to bypass some settlements, but some settlements were situated in such a way that they could snipe and attack the convoys going by. So they had to defeat them. So you have a couple of notable battles. For example, Kfar Darom, which was a religious community. You had a battalion of Arabs attack maybe 30 defenders and held off with heavy casualties. They attack again held off. Made several attacks. I think the Egyptians lost several hundred men in this, lost tanks, armored cars. And then at the middle of the night, at the very bitter end, some were able to evacuate the kibbutz. Another place called Nirim, the same thing happened, where they lost hundreds of soldiers against 30 or 40 defenders. Same with Yad Mordechai. Now, Yad Mordechai actually was conquered, the people pulled out. But what stunned the Egyptians, as well as on the northern side, the Syrians, the Iraqis, and the ALA, was the tenacious defense of every settlement. And this had a huge effect on the war. Because from the Arab side, they're going to roll the Jews up. They had no military intelligence. They thought a Jewish village was like an Arab village. Now, Arab villages had never prepared for defense. They didn't have battlements, they didn't have trenches. They were prepared for, 10 or 15 guys go out and take pot shots at Jews. The idea of fighting, a conquering force was not something they had remotely prepared for. The Jewish side, number one, these settlements were relatively hardened in a very informal sense. I mean, they had trenches, barbed wire. They didn't have any mines or heavy weapons, but they had a lot of determination. They were hidden well, and they were good shots. So in the south, when the Egyptians ran up against these very tenacious settlements, it just shocked them. They could not believe this was happening. The same thing when they went across here up to Hebron, they also ran across settlements, Negba and others, where there were, most of these settlements didn't have more than 30 people, 30 defenders. But they ran into a tenacious defense. And here was the Israeli mindset. I had one of my Hebrew school kids say, well, why did they just pull out? I said, pull out to where? To the next one. Okay. And then where? To the next one. Well, where do you end? You end at the beach. You understand? So instead of dying on the beach, we might as well die here. I have to tell you, when I read these the histories and also autobiographical, It's something that's actually extraordinary of these relatively untrained people, many of them very young, actually fighting to the very last person. And realizing is there's nowhere else to go. If we give up here, where are we going to go? Back one more? Because eventually they hit Tel Aviv, they kill everybody, men, women, and children. So we might as well die here as opposed to die there. And this was a very determined decision that Ben Gurion demanded, and people, of course, were devoted to do, which was to hold every settlement. Up in the north, when the Syrians attacked, they attacked, by the way, I mean, interesting, there's a little settlement up here, actually in the, see the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, right here, the Sea of Galilee. A little settlement right there called Ein Gev in Egyptian territory. They never took it. When they did go through some of them at Mishmar HaYaden and another one, they paid dearly to get through. And then when I think they got through Gesher, but then they pulled back to Degania, and there was a last stand at Degania, and they could not believe it. They had tanks, armor, armored cars, infantry, artillery, on a kibbutz that had a few dozen defenders. They were well placed, and they took a huge toll on the Syrian infantry. They had Molotov cocktails, threw them into Egyptian, Syrian tanks. In fact, if you go to Ganya, you'll actually see a Syrian tank still sitting on the kibbutz. And you read about this, and folks, it's extraordinary, the tenacity and skill of the defenders. And from the Arab side, again, no one said that the Arabs were not courageous. They ran, they got pushed back and ran again and again and again, sometimes up to 8 times to try to take a settlement. So these are not people who are not courageous. They couldn't believe that the Jews didn't fold. And so when they lost tanks and infantry and armor, bashing themselves against these settlements and pulled back, the idea that the settlements could not be rolled up had a huge demoralizing effect on the Arab armies. Huge demoralizing effect. The Syrians did take a couple of settlements for which they paid dearly. The ALA was never able to conquer one settlement, no matter how much they concentrated. 1,000 troops, 2,000 troops, tanks, armor, machine guns, artillery. The ALA never broke one settlement. The idea, remember, we have to go back to Hebron for this. Hebron says, harden every kibbutz. Haganah trained in every kibbutz, trained in the defense. Now, the Arab villages simply had not trained themselves in the defense. So, for example, let's say, I'll just use my hands here. If the Syrian army was here, and now the IDF, the Israeli army, was here, and they want to go for a flanking movement, and there were 2 Arab villages in the way, they just rolled right through. There was no defense. People might run, they might not run. They got here. So Israel could count on the fact that virtually no Arab village would defend itself. No Arab village, there's a few exceptions, but in general, no Arab village would defend itself. When the IDF wanted to take Nazareth, for example, it's a large Arab and Christian population there. The ALA was centered in the area. They were ready for a big fight. The Israeli army came around the backside, and they thought that their backside was secure because it was so highly populated with Arab villages. Well, they just rolled right through, and they attacked from the back, and the ALA just fell apart. So the determination of the settlers, the kibbutzim, not to give an inch, and the relative Arab unpreparedness to defend their villages had, in my mind, a determinative effect on the outcome of the war. Now, as far as the southern front, the Egyptians had the same experience, and when they finally got to there was no town of Ashdod at the time, but in this area here, they finally got to a river. Now you had an idea of formation, you might say a formed brigade that was in the defense, and they just could not get across. So they simply weren't prepared for an expeditionary force that attacked people who were resilient in the defense. And that was a large factor that stopped the Egyptians, stopped the Syrians, stopped the Iraqis, stopped the Lebanese at every level. The fight for Jerusalem was a different thing. The Arab Legion was a highly trained, very effective army, which is one reason Israel could not liberate the old city. And that ended in a stalemate. But remember, the fact that these relatively untrained Israeli soldiers could stand up against the Arab Legion was, again, understood to be miraculous. I mean, the Arab Legion was understood to be unconquerable. There were many battles for a fort called Latrun, which is at the bottom of that road. The Israelis tried at least 4 different times to attack, and probably, I think, a total of about 1,000 men by the time all of them were handled. So if you lost, several hundred in the battle for the roads, several hundred at Latrun, where the Arab Legion dug in, they battered themselves against the Arab Legion and more or less couldn't dislodge them, although they did open the road, and they did stop the Arab Legion from attacking the so-called New City, meaning West Jerusalem. Any comments, questions up to this point? Yeah, one here. The Palestinian Jews were and were understood to be European. Thank you for the question. For them, a Jewish state equaled a European state. Yeah, they hated the Jews, but remember, in their mind, the Jew was a European. So now what happened in Hebron is they didn't like the Lithuanian Jews living north of the city, but they took it out on the local Jews. The animus was against the European Jews, but then it transferred to the local Jews. Look, Hebron is an example. This the Lithuanian Jews they wanted to kill. And they actually said to the rabbi of the Lithuanian yeshiva, you let us kill 70 of your yeshiva guys and we won't attack the local Jews. The rabbi said no, so they killed him and they went on a rampage. So the Jews who lived in the area and lived there for centuries, they coexisted with the Arabs for centuries. When the European Jews came, they were all put in the same basket. They're all Jews. So there was tremendous hatred of Jews, but it began with a hatred of the European Jews, and then applied to the local Jewish population. Is that clear? It didn't begin with hatred of the local Jews. It began with hatred of the European Jews. No, not just Europeans. European Jews. European Jews. There was hatred of Jews, but it hadn't gotten animated till the Europeans arrived. You see, there were Jews who lived all over the land, but up until the early 1900s, they coexisted. The European Jews arriving, every Jew had to go. Now, by the way, this was mostly in the ALA. As I read, when the Egyptian army, for example, conquered a Yishuv and they took 100 prisoners, they didn't ask for the prisoners, they shipped them back to Egypt to a POW camp. When the Arab Legion captured Jews, like in the Old City, they shipped them to Jordan, they sat in a POW camp. It was more the local population that was filled with a hatred of the Jew. I think for the regular armies, it was more of a military thing. There were even people who were taken prisoner by the Syrian army that made it back to POW camps. So it's, by the way, I should add here before our time runs out that you've oftentimes read about the refugee problem. A great number fled out of fear. A great number fled out of fear. Others fled when there was vicious fighting to get out of the way of the fighting. So, for example, the Battle of Jaffa. It was a vicious, vicious fight, and many Arabs fled because they didn't want to get caught up in the fighting. They fled down to Gaza. I say toward the war was fought in 3 different stages, basically May, early June, 10 days in July, picked up again October 15th until the end of the war. I would say in the 10 days in July, and the last one, was when there was a consciousness, if we take over an Arab village, we're going to expel the population and burn it to the ground, because that's what they did to us. Every village that they conquered, they burnt it to the ground and expelled the residents. We will return the favor. So of the 700,000 who fled, it's hard to know who, but I'm going to guess most fled, some were expelled. The 156 or so thousand that stayed were unmolested. In Haifa, there was an effort to have the Arab population of Haifa stay. This is well documented, and they decided to leave. The British got them on boats and took them to Lebanon. So the Arab refugee population is people who fled and were told, get out and come back with us when we conquer the land, and we'll give it back to you. Because from the Arab military perspective, they didn't want the local Arab population in their way when they attacked the Israelis. They wanted them out of the way. So you'll see on the other side, there's a call, get out of our way, get behind our lines, we'll take you back in once we've conquered. Now, once they realized that the Arab villages were not fighting, even though they began to say, please hold your ground, then they began to forbid people from fleeing. So the refugee thing is a very, very complex issue. Of course, still to today. I want to talk about Gaza a little bit, so let me say that every war since then, the 1956 war from the Israeli side was to stop terrorism coming in from Gaza and Egypt. The 1967 war was actually just the continuation of this war and a stunning Israeli victory. The 1973 war was to reverse the Israeli victory of 1967, which went very badly for the Syrians. The Egyptians actually got the Sinai Desert back. So every war since then has been the replaying out of this war. So what's happening in Gaza? So you have to remember that Hamas has declared war on Israel ever since the beginning of Hamas. When you hear Hamas, you have to think, is in a war with Israel, a declared war. It's not a secret. They want to destroy the state of Israel, and according to their charter, kill every Jew. You find in the Hamas charter language taken over from the Nazis, that the Jews are, in the Hamas charter, Jews are responsible for drug, prostitution. All the ills of Western society is the Jew. So the Hamas charter not only is anti-Israel, it's anti-Semitic. It's a vile kind of anti-Semitism. And they're committed to the destruction of Israel. Now, what their path has been, again, I'll say along with all the liberation movements, was terrorism. How do you get rid of the colonists? You terrorize them until they pack up and go home. I think there's been a realization that Israelis don't see themselves as colonists, and there's nowhere to pack up and go home to. Where do most Israelis come from? Arab countries. Meaning, once the state was established, 700,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries and came to Israel. So you say the majority of Jews today are descended from Iraqis, Moroccans, Tunisians, et cetera, et cetera. So its population is descended from expelled Jews. And where do they have to go back to? Going back to Iran? Going back to Iraq? Egypt, Morocco? They're not going anywhere. So when I look at the strategy of Hamas, I think they realize something. The strategy of murdering Jews through terrorism does not have a good effect for their struggle. And I think they consciously made this idea. There's two things they want to do. Number one, kidnap Israeli soldiers to trade for Hamas people in prison. They very much want to get their hands on an Israeli soldier, very deeply. I can't emphasize how much they want to get their hands on an Israeli soldier. When Gilad Shalit was returned, one Israeli soldier for 1,000 Arab prisoners. Okay? I think what they realize is the war is not going to be won through terrorist attacks. I'm not saying they're going to stop terrorism because they hate Jews. But the war is going to be won in the newspaper. This they understand. So the so-called protest at the fence was to cover attacks on the border to create breaches in the border. Now I want you to think for a moment. You're Israeli soldiers, you got a platoon of guys, let's say 40 guys, snipers, you're looking down. They're 500 yards over there. And you say, don't cross the 300-yard line. And they do. But the world says don't shoot because you're not under danger. Then they actually are able to tear the concertina wire, right? They're able to tear it up, and they actually get inside Israel. And 1,000, 2,000 people come rushing through. Among those 2,000 people, there's going to be 200 or 300 that are armed and want to get an Israeli soldier. Clear? Your kid is on that hill. Now they're running right up the hill. Now that platoon of Israeli soldiers now has a choice. Do you machine gun 2,000 Gazans down? Well, according to the world, no, because they're quote unquote unarmed. What happens when they actually breach the line? Because we're not allowed to shoot. You can only shoot when they're right on you. And of course, by then it's too late. They've breached the line. They're going to murder the soldiers up there. They're going to grab somebody, take them back, and now you're going to have, several, several, if not several dozen Israeli soldiers spirited across and hidden in basements in Gaza. That's their plan. So Israel said, you know what? Instead of fighting here and here and here and here, we're going to draw a line right here. If you cross this line, we will shoot you. Now, you could choose to cross the line or not cross the line, because to cross that line and say, okay, the line's actually here. The world's going to be any happier when they're shot at the barbed wire? Of course not. When they cross the barbed wire and start running up the hill, is the world going to say, okay, now you can shoot them? At what point will the world say to the Israeli army, you can shoot civilians? When? Never. Never, never, never. If these so-called civilians rush the hill, grab soldiers, take them back, the world will not care. Okay? And I'm saying factually. Now, so from the Israeli perspective, those are our sons and daughters on that hill. And I actually have a daughter in the Israeli army. Those are our sons and daughters on that hill. We don't want our sons and daughters attacked by a mob, maybe dismembered and butchered, and certainly not spirited across the border to Gaza and not seeing my kid for 5 years within the hands of Hamas, where we'll ever see him again. So I want you to understand Israel. Israel said, we'll never win the war of the press, because the press likes pictures. You know, a guy with a Molotov cocktail and has the bandana. I mean, the optics are fantastic for the Hamas side. I think Israel has said, we'll never win the war of optics. We've got to give them the optics. And the reporters today will never win the war of reporters, because reporters don't know anything. I mean, when I read they never say Hamas, dedicated to the destruction of Israel, blah, blah, blah. Protesters who cross the protest line with Molotovs, cocktails, pistols, and so forth, they don't give you enough information because protesters are valiant and soldiers are bad. So that's the narrative that they want to insist on. And why not? It sells papers. From the Israeli side, they said, we know what's up. The minute you breach the line, we know what's going to happen. You flood in 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, right? They're going to grab a soldier and head back the other way. So we're not accepting that. Now, here's the interesting thing that I read. I read the Israeli press, and the Israeli press is much closer to the Israeli defense establishment. And what they're saying is, Hamas has reached across and said, can we come to some kind of deal? The Hamas side says, we'll quiet down, but we need something in return. You got to give us something. Israel says, nothing. Nothing. We're not going to reward you for this. What you can do is get 300 yards back behind the border and stay there, because anybody who crosses that, we're going to shoot. Now, whom are the people that they're shooting? Almost entirely men. And men 15 and up. You can't tell between a 15 and an 18-year-old. So they're shooting men. Many of them identified Hamas, but even if they're not, they're the instigators. So remember, you're an Israeli soldier. Your job is find the instigator, shoot him. Because if they come across the line, 1,000 people get across, we're going to have a real massacre. So this is the Israeli thinking. For I understand, Hamas has just reached out and said, can we stop this? Can you give us something? Israel says, no, we're not going to give you anything. And apparently, Israel has won the standoff. They haven't won the optics war and the press war, but this is probably going to come to an end. That's one thing. Secondly, the Israeli intelligence defense establishment shares what they know with the European countries. Right? They know that Israel is targeting Hamas operatives, known terrorists, and instigators. They're not massacring women and children. And the European countries, if you look at their condemnations, it's very tepid. It's very tepid. Why is it tepid? Because they know if you're a Gazan, you don't want to get killed, just don't come up to the border. Very simple. They're not going after you. Just don't come up to them. So not one person in Gaza would be killed if they didn't try to violate the borderline. And Israel, uncharacteristically saying, we don't care about optics, we don't care about the newspaper, we care about making sure that our soldiers don't get kidnapped. You attack our border, we will kill you. It's really hard. It's hard. But I don't know if there's another option, to tell you the truth. I personally don't know if there's another option other than the tragic decision to stop them from busting through the border, because that would be catastrophic for both sides. Yeah. Okay, from the Hamas side. Yeah. Yeah, let me report this out. So Hamas has an interest of being, tough on crime, meaning tough on Israel. They got to do something to keep their status. But I think there's another thing. They know that the existence of the state of Israel depends on Washington, D.C., okay? If the United States turns against Israel, Israel is done for, more or less. If America stops supporting Israel, Israel is done for. They're playing to the American population, who by looking at these optics will, not vote in, let's say, pro-Israeli politicians, and eventually erode American support for Israel, which will be devastating for Israel. Okay? And that definitely is a plan to erode American support for Israel. Question? Okay. All right, let me bring this out. Another part of this, why aren't the other Arab countries, aside from Turkey calling an ambassador back, who's already not even there, these are basically stay home for a while. Because Erdogan, again, has to be tough on crime. But you don't find the other countries are making a lot of noise, but there's an unspoken alliance between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, several Gulf states, and Israel, and Turkey, and the United States against Iran. Because Iran is Shiite, Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and Shias and Sunnis hate each other more than you can possibly imagine. You can't even imagine how much they hate each other. One time at night, I was, sometimes Israeli TV gets a broadcast from Lebanon, like a talk show, and they translate it into Hebrew at the bottom of the screen. So I'm watching this talk show where these two guests, a Sunni and a Shia, they're screaming at each other, right? And I'm seeing the Hebrew at the bottom, and one says, "I would rather marry my daughter to a Zionist than a Shiite dog like you." I went, wow, that's some real hatred there, okay? So they're terrified of Iran, they hate Iran, and of course Hamas's report is supported by Iran, okay? So the Egyptians don't like Hamas. Remember when they say Israel's blockade, by the way, there's no blockade, there's controlled access. Israel ships in thousands of tons of goods every single day. Look at COGAT, Commission for the Organization of Governmental Assistance, COGAT Israel. You'll see the thousands of tons that is imported to Gaza every day. There's no blockade. They're saying if you want something, push it through Ashdod, we'll check to make sure there's no guns in there, and then we'll ship it to Gaza. There's no blockade. Same thing from the Egyptian side. So when people say to me, the Israeli blockade, I say, what about Egypt? There's an Egyptian border. That's also closed. Why? There's no loss of friendship between Hamas and Egypt. The Egyptians also don't like them because they're supported by the Iranians. Okay? So there's no blockade, there's controlled access. Realize, every time you hear the word blockade means nothing gets through. Controlled access means we check out what you're sending there so we can make sure it's not military. Okay? There is no blockade. So Egyptians control the southern border of Gaza. They also don't let anything in. Okay? So one thing that's happening now is, what's getting played out here is Israel understands there is an undeclared alliance, but very active behind the scenes, again, of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, some Gulf states, Jordan, some degree Turkey, United States, I think England, France, and Germany. They're all together against ISIS, number one, I think against Hamas, and to some degree, maybe not the Europeans, against Iran. Remember, Iran is supporting Hamas, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to this day is an active supporter of terrorism. So I think that's one reason Israel felt that they could draw a hard line, that the fallout is not going to be terrible. Okay, let me take a few questions right here. Okay, the decision, the decision to move a sign on a door. Just remember. But no, people say move the embassy. They think they go in with a forklift and move the embassy. They just took a sign off the door, embassy, put it here, and took the consulate sign and put it over there. That's all they've done. Okay? Basically. It's a street sign. No, I know, but I'm answering your question. No, I'm answering your question. No, totally, I'm going to answer all your questions. I'll answer all your questions. Okay, I'll answer all your questions. Okay. I think one thing of Trump's policy, and I think it's more considered than we might imagine, is actually ramping things up. Like with North Korea. I believe the so-called sanctions against North Korea, I think they were loosely, if ever, enforced. I think Trump came into power and actually tightened the screws to the point where North Korea had a choice to make. All this bellicose behavior, whatever you're going to do, do it. Because here's what we're going to do. We're going to crush you economically. Now, with Israel, here's the thing. Everybody says, oh, but if you move the embassy, there's going to be trouble. Now, let's think for a minute the history of trouble. The terrorist attacks, the launching of rockets from Gaza in 2010, 2014, the Lebanon war, thousands of rockets come over. The embassy was in Tel Aviv. So if the embassy was such a big deal, at what point did you ever hear from the Arab side, well, we're not doing everything we can because the embassy is still in Tel Aviv? The movement of the embassy to Jerusalem is basically another statement that says, we're going to ratchet these things up and see what happens. Now, here's what's happened on the other side. The Saudi Arabians have said to the Palestinians, Abu Dis is in East Jerusalem, have your embassy there. Trump said the same thing. He said, I'm not saying East Jerusalem can't, I said the American embassy is in West Jerusalem. I think Trump actually said it. The embassy for Palestine will be in East Jerusalem, right? So if you're going to have an embassy in East Jerusalem, you have one in West Jerusalem. They also said, clearly under any settlement in any universe, our embassy is going to be in Jerusalem, as will the American embassy to Palestine be in Jerusalem, just in East Jerusalem. So people are looking at this, but anybody who looks at it fairly, obviously the embassy is going to be there eventually. Trump has announced that the Palestinians will have their one in East Jerusalem. The Saudi Arabia said to the Palestinians, just take it. So you begin to see that somehow by ratcheting this up, we kind of see where people fell. Saudi Arabians, Egyptians, Jordanians, Gulf states kind of fell over and said, not such a big deal. In fact, remember when Trump went to Saudi Arabia, he was feted by the Arab League. 22 nations were basically kissing his ring when Trump, which I didn't understand. I did not understand how Trump got so popular in the Arab world. I don't know what he did, right? I have a theory, okay? So I think Trump's policy is to heat things up and see where things fall out, because eventually they're going to get heated up anyway. We might as well find out now. So are things going to get worse? This thing at the Gaza fence would be happening, embassy move or not. It doesn't make any difference. Okay, American support for Israel. I can't imagine anybody who supports Israel say, well, now I don't support because the embassy's in West Jerusalem. Okay, Peter Beinart's erosion among younger Jews. So you leave the embassy in Tel Aviv, that's going to turn around? But I think there's not a commitment of the leadership of that group to support Israel. There's more of a commitment to see how your support's been eroding, as opposed to stop the erosion. So I think there's a real question of leadership in the American Jewish community. I don't find a decisive sense we're going to keep these people in the corral supporting Israel. I think there's a preference for something of a I told you so. So when younger Jews don't support Israel, it's to say, we're right. Right about what? Israel has to come to an accommodation, meaning what? A Palestinian state. Okay, Israel pulls back the 1967 borders. Free elections in the West Bank. Who's going to get elected to power in the West Bank, the first election they have? Hamas. And now you have Gaza next door to Jerusalem. So tell me what that solves. I understand. But everybody who says two-state solution, withdraw to the 1967, 1949 borders, it doesn't make any sense. But that's what people say. Israel should withdraw to the 1949 borders, create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and everything's going to be great. It's actually, everything's going to be far worse than we can possibly imagine. So what's that? What would be better? I don't know what would be better, but I know we don't want a Hamas state on the West Bank in half of Jerusalem. I know that. I don't know what the answer is, but I know it's not the answer. So you're asking what I think? I think that the idea that if we created a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, which Hamas would take over in a heartbeat, is not going to solve the problem. My friends who disagree with me, I'm asking them, so you describe to me what you think is likely to happen. There's a lot of hope. A lot of hope in the goodness of human beings. And I don't place any hope in the goodness of human beings. personally. I don't think you can rely on that when there's this much hatred and this much history. Okay, so what to do in the future, I don't know, but I can say that the Gaza fence is just this war with a different kind of a tactic. The strategy is the same, destroy Israel. The tactic is win the war in the press to erode support for Israel. I think that's what's happening now. Okay, a couple more and then we'll end for tonight and we can continue in the cafe informally. Yes, over here. Yeah, so the argument in favor of Trump is they passed the law under Clinton, and ever since then it's been a wink that says, yeah, embassy Jerusalem, fine, it's part of the platform of both parties, move along. And Trump finally says, actually, I'm going to turn the heat up, see what happens. And he turned the heat up, and basically nothing happened. Okay, so the question is, what's happening on the Egyptian border? How much crime and bribery? From my understanding, the position of the Egyptian government is they don't want goods flowing from Gaza into Egypt, because that includes ISIS and Islamic Jihad. And they don't want Egyptian weapons going into there because it's going to be used on Egyptians as much as anybody else. Now, Egypt cannot control its own borders. Okay? I mean, there's so much corruption, so much bribery, that Egypt itself is having trouble just keeping order in the Sinai Desert, where you'll know about every couple months, another dozen Egyptian soldiers get massacred by ISIS, who seem to have a free hand in the Sinai Desert. So the fact that the border is porous doesn't mean that al-Sisi is determining that it be porous. I think that ISIS is kind of like their, Wild West. It's not fully under government control. Last question over here. Yeah, so the precedent of right of return, there's, on one hand, I think from the Palestinian side, it doesn't matter. A great wrong has been done, and you're not going to look to international law to fix it. It's either going to be Israel packs up and goes home, or we're going to win a military struggle. Okay? So I don't want to say that we can have a debate and find no precedent. Palestinians are going to go, oh, yeah, okay, since we didn't find a precedent, we're going to go home. Right? It really doesn't matter when this thing. But from your question, I can't think of a time when international law has created a right of refugee return. I'm not an historian, but I can't think of a precedent. There's been repatriation, but I don't think anything like this. All right, so last question over here. I've been ignoring this side. Okay, last question. I think if Iran could no longer support Hezbollah and Hamas, they would fold very quickly. So that's why I think, this sounds really hardcore, but I really don't, the idea to crush the Iranian economy so they can't support these expeditionary endeavors in Hezbollah and Hamas, which are created, among other things, to destroy Israel. So I think if Iran were weakened, everything would get better. And especially Hamas would be weakened and Hezbollah would be weakened. Those two entities, which are profoundly committed to the destruction of Israel, I think they would be weakened as well. There's a so-called, there's the A rail of all this big geopolitical stuff. There's a small one about cooperation on all kinds of small things. Water rights, ambulance service, electrical grid. For example, Israel is now giving the Palestinians their own electrical grid because they've had to pay for electricity from Israel. They're behind in their bill. Israel has to tax. It's a mess. So Israel says, you know what? Have your own electrical grid. Right? So all of a sudden, there's this idea of Palestinians of actually beginning, maybe not to have their own independent country, but a working infrastructure, a working court system, and so forth. So the plan B is the facts on the ground will accumulate to a Palestinian state, and the international kind of stuff is just going to catch up. So I've read a book and heard a good lecture on the so-called Track A and Track B. A lot going on Track B, and Track A, I think, is better than ever because of the coalition that's been created against Iran and ISIS. It's come down to Israel's favor. Now I'm going to give you a little anecdote. Our daughter is a combat medic in the Israeli army, and she's on a base somewhere deep in the West Bank. And so when she got there, they call a hakpatza is when the medics are alerted and they jump into an ambulance and they go outside the main gate. So her first hakpatza, they get in, they go out, and it's an Arab with an eye infection from the local village, because it's 2 hours to the next hospital. They get another hakpatzah, it's someone who fell off the roof. They get another hakpatzah, it's a guy who had a panic attack because his mother had just died. And she says, what's going on? She says, oh, like we're the infirmary for the village next door. Okay. She goes, okay. And she's helped so many Arabs. Like she just told us about a little boy who had an epileptic fit, and she had the kid, and the dad came, and he showed all the medical paperwork to the medics, and they were looking at it all, and she gave him an injection. She says, oh, my daddy is such a beautiful little kid. And so I got to tell you, in this little corner of the world, there's an Israeli military base, an Arab village, and they have a beautiful relationship. Okay, now here's the last thing. She calls me and says, Daddy, I treated my first terrorist. I said, what happened? Well, he tried to stab an Israeli soldier. They got him, arrested him, and they brought him to the infirmary. I said, why? She says, because before they put anybody in jail, they have to get a medical checkup. She said, I can't believe 3 o'clock in the morning, they call me out, and she said, I think you're a terrorist. I just don't want to be waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, can't you wait till 6 in the morning? But, right, I thought to myself, so every guy who tries to murder an Israeli soldier, they get the guy, drive him to the clinic, wake up my daughter at 3 o'clock in the morning. She comes out, checks out, and says, okay, he's healthy. You know, not beat up, nothing. All his bones are in place. Taken to jail for attempted murder. But I thought to myself, that's pretty decent. That's pretty decent. There's a lot said there. You don't read about any of this. And I'm just thinking, this is one kid in one base. And I'm trying to think, if you imagine all the things that are going on, I'm going back to the cab driver that you mentioned. The cab driver says, if peace in your heart, there's going to be peace. All over the place, there's cooperation that we don't even see. Last little example, our daughter was, elder daughter in college in Herzliya. And last year, she's devoting time to teach English to Muslim girls in Jaffa. So she goes 1 day a week, she goes down there, and they know some Hebrew, so she's teaching English to them, and they're loving that they have an American kid. And they say, tell us about teenage in America. So our daughter, she looks young, she's 24 now, maybe 22 then. She tells them about it, and they say, okay, we want to have a birthday party. So they veil the windows, tape everything, close everything, turn on the iTunes, take off the hijabs, and had a crazy rock party so our daughter could show them all the music and all the dances. Things done, everything back to order, open the doors, open the windows, the hijab back in place, and everybody's cool. And I thought, that is so cool. She said, Daddy, I can't tell anybody. I can't put this in the paper, but I got to tell you, they love us and we love them, and they're very appreciative. So I could tell you so many stories of having kids live in Israel, of stuff that you just don't see here. But like you, on the geopolitical, I'm skeptical. But on the human contact level, I hear so many, not just from my kids, wonderful stories of people getting along with each other. So part of me is skeptical and part of me is hopeful. All right, thank you, everybody. And I'll...
Sing, shalom, sing, shalom, sing, shalom, tova uveracha. Sing, shalom, sing, shalom, sing, shalom, tova uveracha. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay.